Yeah, and I've had conversations with a lot of biotech leaders about I guess the chronology and cadence of hiring decisions in specific leadership disciplines on the continuum, right? Like when do we hire a CSO? When do we hire a chief medical officer? When do we hire a chief regulatory officer? When do we hire a chief commercialization officer? And it doesn't sound formulaic. It doesn't sound like there's a formulaic approach to doing that. But it sounds like those decisions are crucial to the strategy that you're discussing, right? Like, does Treehill advise on
Yeah.
that sort of that HR element?
Yeah, so we don't advise on the HR element. We actually perform that role. So
Mm.
we developed a clinical development optimization model,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to pick three letters, so CDO model, and because I know why not? Everyone else has three letters, and the CDO model is we will work with the company, the board, their investors, and external consultants. So it's not just a Treehill effort, and the objective there is optimizing your drug development as the word as the CDO kind of says, as the label says, and the objective there is exactly as I said before: 30% reduction in cost of development, 9 to 12 months reduction in timeline, um, taking your change order from your industry 18% down to low single digits, and in each of those situations, being far more robust in the way that TPP is developed and commercially relevant, and putting a robust team in place that not only puts the CDP in place but oversees the CDP throughout the development of the cycle. And we've been working with Fosun Pharma USA, the large Chinese company, was one of the first companies to adopt this, and that has been instrumental in identifying interesting molecules that can be developed for the US market using the CDO model. So on that one, if we need to bring in a CMO for a specific indication, we will help identify that person, help bring that person, and work with that person to put the CDP in place.
Yeah. All right. I want to get your perspective on. I'm just thinking as we're discussing this. I'm thinking like internally, right? Like I'm Matt Pillar, and this is my Acme Biotech is my biotech company, and we're developing around a molecule, and I've got a team of people who are, qualified to help me move from node to node to node in the traditional node to node to node sense, right? And maybe I've got the benefit of some foresight. I can maybe I can look 6 nodes down. That's good. I can look 6 nodes down the line. Um, I, I might be able to implement that internally, build it into my culture. Say, hey, this is how the roadmap's here. But there are outside, maybe traditional institutions in the biotech landscape, around the biotech landscape, that have influence um, that exert some pressure, right, on my company and hundreds and hundreds of others. They're investors, perhaps, right? Like I need to show some stuff. I need to show some movement on these, on the trajectory from node to node to node to continue to attract investment dollars. Maybe maybe they're the regulatory agencies, FDA and EMA, who are like, in order for me to move down the regulatory continuum, I've got to show in the sort of traditional paradigm some progress. How do I deal with those? Like, how do I deal with those external? Maybe it's my board, right? I got a board that comes from the traditional biotech space or biopharmaceutical space, and their expectations are based on just the way we've always done it. So I guess the question, if I'm trying to be concise about it, is how do I deal with the external influences that may kind of stand in the way of the efficiency that you're describing, right? Just based on history and tradition.
You're completely correct. The human capital and the management of human capital, the management of human interaction is the hardest part of this. My approach and Treehill's approach has been, we will keep if you ask us an honest question, we'll give you an honest answer that is independent of politics, independent of P&L, for us, and independent of benefit something that would benefit Treehill, for example. So we will tell you exactly what we think in an unfiltered way. We don't get involved in company politics, and we step in and say, look, this is what we've seen. This is what we think you should do. What we find is certain companies are so embroiled in I always call it a molecule in a context. That program or that molecule is in the context. I'd say 50% of the time we can help that program if we can solve the context. But in 50% of the times, we can't solve the context. So you've got an angry board, you've got an angry shareholder, you've got legal constraints, you've got all sorts of factors where, if you have an honest, sit down session where you roll your sleeves up and say, look, guys, I know this is what you're trying to achieve. That's not how the world has played out. This is what we have. This is how we can all win. As long as we're going for a win-win, which we think we can guide you through, everybody needs to come to the table with a compromise of some sort. What we find is when people are reasonable, you can almost always find that compromise. So I'll give you an example of this. US company, phase 3 asset, has spent 110 million to recruit 12 patients over a 3-year period. This trial was not recruiting.
Yeah.
And we had a conversation with the management and said to them, you need to kill your phase 3. This just isn't recruiting. The way it was set up, this trial just won't. You will do better by terminating that study, taking your follow-on compound, designing a phase 3, and you will get a readout quicker than the study will continue recruiting. Another 30 to 40 million spent on that product on that study over the course of the next 12 months. New management came in, new management came back and said, why didn't we listen to your advice 12 months ago, 30 million ago? How would you kill the phase 3 without killing our share price? And we said, look, you need to be honest with you. This is a US listed company. You need to be honest with your investors. You need a non-deal roadshow. You need to go around to all your research analysts. You need to go around to each of your investors and you need to explain to them, to the extent you can based on the confidentiality and disclosure, and et cetera. You need to work with your IR companies. You need to go around and you need to educate the market. The share prices move because people are surprised. You need to go around and you need to do, one, the right thing for shareholders, two, right thing for patients, and you need to go around and have an honest conversation where you take the bull by the horn and you let people know, obviously with lawyers involved and everything else, that you're about to kill a phase 3 that you spend 150 million on. The board ummed and ahed for 6 months, spent another 15 million, came back and said, we think we're going to do that now. And he said, okay, what do you think the share price reaction will be? We're like, it won't move. They're like, but 80% of our share price is linked to the phase 3. We said, well, it isn't. We've spoken to your top shareholders, we've spoken to your research analysts, and it isn't.
Yeah.
Share price moved 1.2%.
Yeah.
On the day the market had moved 2%. We've done that repeatedly. So when you say to people, look, if you want a solution, there is a solution there, but we need to remove the context of the program. So everyone put emotions aside. Let's move into the surgical theater component. If there is something that we need to cut out, we need to cut it out. If you don't want to cut out, then you know this is going to fail. Then you can all blame each other, and sometimes they blame us. We step in and say, look, this is what we think you need to fix it. Then they turn around and go, well, you should have advised us 5 years before you knew us. And you go, well, look, I'm not part of the, I'm not the patient. I'm the one you came to see in the ER department. I didn't make you sick.
Yeah.
So on this one, when people, it's a human capital, again, going back to the 50% of phase 3s fail because of the molecule of humans. I'd say most of the time, when you say to someone, I think we need to course correct, it's not new information to them. They go, we've been saying the same thing. We just can't get it past the board. We can't get the shareholders. And then we work with people either frontline or behind the scenes and saying, look, this is how we've convinced other people to make that decision.
Yeah. I get the sense that, not to put too sharp a point on it, I get the sense that at least at first blush, at first meeting, boards don't necessarily care for Treehill's involvement.
No, boards are actually very receptive.
Really?
Yeah, boards are very receptive. I think we get pulled in by boards more often than we get pulled in by management.
Hmm.
Because I've been on boards, I am on boards. We've done a whole analysis of how much boards know about a company. We have this whole metric by which we did this analysis where we asked the company 900 questions, and we went through CEO, CMO, CSO, etc. Asked them about their role, their function, then asked them about each other's role and function, and then we went to the board members, and we did this in over 100 companies, and then we came up with the conclusion. We then went to the board members and said, how much of this did you know? And they said between 5 to 10% is like 6.7% of that information did the boards have. So when a board is making a decision, it's making a decision based on incomplete and a lot of times relatively selective information they're receiving. So a lot of times when boards turn around and say, look, can we get you guys as Treehill to step in? We want you to work with management. We don't want to get into any sort of running battles. Can you just lay out the land that we have? We had this call this morning. It's a board that has invested $250 million in a company. They're trying to figure out where they go next. They pulled us in. These are people who put their own money in, their own blood and sweat and tears. And they're saying, Treehill, we want an honest opinion. Tell us what you think we should do. Work with management to get us to a place where we think we need to get to. So actually, contrary to what you think, boards actually pull us in, but they can only pull you in under a couple of guises. One, they're asking you an honest question and they're expecting an honest answer. Two, they're asking you a question which you're going to answer in a selfless manner. So a lot of times you give people advice that doesn't result in more money for Treehill. And they need to know that when they're looking into your eyes, you're giving them the honest advice, which is the best advice for the company, not the best advice for you as an advisor.
Yeah. I guess I just assume that if a board, is boarding well, and, you also assume that boards come with a fair share of ego, right? A fair amount of ego on the board. I guess I just assume that if that were the case, then and everything were going swimmingly, why would we need Treehill?
Yeah, I think so. So
is that naive? Is like there's just
no,
naive awesome.
It's not naive, but if you let me use NASCAR as an analogy.
NASCAR analogy. Now you're speaking to the American audience here.
Go with this with me for a second. I may stumble over it. If you're racing in a NASCAR, if you look at the NASCAR teams, there is an unlimited depth of driver talent, engineering talent, marketing talent, so on and so forth. If you step in as a privateer, nobody cares that your car is a privateer car when the scoreboards come out. They look at it and say, okay, were you first, second, third, or fourth? Mm-hmm. So privateers need to act and behave and compete at a standard which is world leading when it comes to that specific type of racing. When you're developing a drug and you want that drug to be licensed by GSK, AstraZeneca, or Novartis, what would make you think that you can develop that drug in anything but exactly the same high quality manner as a GSK, AstraZeneca, or Novartis? If you develop the drug to your standard and not to their standard, and you think your standard is any different, do not expect at any point they're going to pick up your drug. So, can Treehill be helpful in your journey? We think we can. Will we be stronger together, make less mistakes together? I think we will be. And if we work well, you're receptive, and we're lucky, we might be able to hit the GSK and AstraZeneca and Novartis and Roche standards.
Yeah.
If we are driven by ego and by desire to be right, as opposed to doing the right thing, we're not going to be matching the levels of your large cap pharma, and we're never going to win a NASCAR race. We're just not going to.
Yeah.
Now, what do we like? We like the, Carroll Shelby, story. Why do we like that? Because we like the underdog. We want to show, but then, Ford couldn't get there on their own. Ford had to get Carroll Shelby in, and Carroll Shelby had to bring his own driver in. Did Ford actually, did the middle layer of Ford fight that? they did fight it because it was showing their inability to actually deliver. And why should who's Carol Shelby to be able to help forward? You wouldn't expect a group of 10, 15 individuals to be able to change a behemoth's behavior. But what we found in that example, which is that, again, sticking to a racing analogy, is that people were receptive enough and humble enough to understand that Carol Shelby and his team could actually make a difference to Ford, and that relationship continues to today. What we do at Treehill, we're not arrogant in a sense of we have the answers. We have seen a lot of mistakes. We have been in the trenches when difficult decisions were made, or right decisions were made but had bad outcomes. All we do is to sit down with you guys and say, look, we've got a big team. Everyone on the team has 20, 25 years of drug development expertise. We together can hopefully make better decisions, better informed decisions, and either prevent us making mistakes in the future. And if things have gone wrong, I can't think of a better, more seasoned team that people sit in and say, I was in that room with the FDA when I got a complete response letter. I was in the room where they dropped my vial of API and I can't start the clinical study. I was in the room when that CRO did this. I was in the room where, my share price went down 80% for something that so being in that room, all it does is gives you enough scars and enough experience to say, just think about this. As you're making a decision, as your company, your decision, this is how we are providing additional a lens that is, again, hopefully selfless in you making the best decision you can make.
Yeah. We're running short on time, Ali, but do you have time for a couple more?
Yep.
Couple more. Well, first of all, are you a motorsports guy? A lot of motorsports analogies. Yeah. Formula One, I assume.
No, anything with an engine.
Yeah, that's cool. You talked about ego. Your response just now alluded to some potentially emotional stuff, right? Like, you're the leader of the company. This is your ship. Like, we're coming in objectively. And I imagine, if you think about what motivates emotionally, what motivates a biotech leader and the biotech leaders' teams, it might be a sense of purpose, altruism. It might be money. It might be, that adrenaline rush of discovery, societal impact. Any number of things motivate these leaders, and every single one of those things has a strong emotion tied to it. And not everyone, can shelve that emotion. It's not easy to be objective when you have an emotional attachment to what you're doing. So how do you manage that? And I guess not only how do you manage it, you and Treehill, but what advice do you have for people on the client side, biotech leaders, for managing their own emotions around important decisions? You talk about a few minutes ago, you're talking about, killing $150 or $180 million investment in a phase 3 trial. Like, that's emotional stuff. I don't care how objective, you pretend to be. So what do you do? Like, how do you work through that emotion when your consult is, I imagine, sometimes, maybe often, not exactly what your client wants to hear?
There's a couple of things. So going into the social context, 30 years after graduating, 29 after years graduating, any surgeon who says, I didn't go home and cry after losing a patient or seeing something that day is not being true to themselves. I think there's if you're looking for longevity, you need to make sure that you have a coping mechanism, and that coping mechanism isn't alcohol based or drug based or some sort of self-harm based. So you need to find a positive outlet, whether it's travel, motorsports, whatever it is. There needs to be a positive route, because you're absorbing a lot of negative input, and you need to be able to stay in the moment, and you need to be calm and collected and the ice cold when you're coming to making decisions. Now, the minute you step out of that context and the patient as you've dealt with a patient situation, you can go home and cry. But you're paid, and your role as a professional in that moment is to be ice cold. And I've over the past 30 years have been criticized for that many times. It's like, you don't show any emotion.
Mm.
Well, you're not paying me to show emotion now. I can go home and cry, or I can do whatever I want to do, or punch a wall. But
I was, by the way, real quick, I was actually quite proud of myself. I got you to smile and laugh a couple times on this podcast.
um, um, but you in the moment you're ice cold, and I think there it's a genetic point in the sense of, for me, the higher the pressure situation, the calmer and colder I am, and you're making tough decisions because you need to keep your head in the game until the game is over, and then you can deal with your own personal emotions. With Treehill, over time it's evolved because I can sit there and I can talk to CEOs and chairmen and say, I sat in that seat. I sat in a seat where we had, $10,000 left in the account as a CEO. I sat in that seat where I realized that, our information was being leaked to a competitor. So as you've gone on in the game, as one has gone on in the game, a lot of times it's easier to talk to someone as a peer, as opposed to kind of sitting there, on a bit of a pedestal and saying, well, it's kind of obvious this is going to happen, because that is never obvious in the moment. So that's one way we do it. Second is, in the moment where things are difficult, and we've been in very difficult situations with Bayer, for example, we've been in a difficult situation with Novartis, so it doesn't have to be smaller companies. And you turn up and you get on a flight and you go and sit with people and you walk through a situation. In this Altana in 2005, where the study read out the wrong way. Get on the next flight, go and sit with people, have dinner with them, and say, what just happened and how do we work through this together? And you roll your sleeve up, and very quickly the emotion dissipates and people start finding a way to look at solutions as opposed to a way that people are looking to blame. Now, people, and this is a bit of a using a medical analogy of someone passing, people either go down a healthy mourning process and they're mourning a death, for example, or mourning a negative event, or people get arrested at mourning and they just need to blame. And they'll blame management, or the management blame board, and then they blame us, and then they blame the molecule, then they blame the trial center, etc. And hopefully you can get someone over that hump. But sometimes people get into that arrested mourning and they can't get out of that loop, and they will destroy the situation. And when you get into that negative situation, you just need to walk away and say, look, this is one you need to just close shop. Not because you can't get out of it, but your dynamic isn't allowing you to get out of it. Where emotions take place. And what we do at Treehill is, and I'll use a police analogy for this. If you look at frontline police officers, and the study showed that they should really be online at frontline for about 9 months, then they go need to sit in an office for 6 or 12 months to resensitize and be able to kind of normalize, and then they go to the front line again. But I see a lot of police officers come to the emergency room, for example, and they've been on in the front line for 10 to 20 years, and you get burnout from that. Mm-hmm. So from our perspective, what we have is a team where if I start getting emotionally involved, Max steps in. If Max starts getting emotionally involved, I step back in. Damien steps in, for example, who's done more biotech restructures than anyone I've ever met. So we have a team where every single person is being chosen by us as a group, because everybody has an independent voice. And if I'm stepping out of line or I'm getting emotional, there is no one in the team that will hesitate for a second to pull me back. So you have a team that helps mean reversion, as opposed to a team that kind of cheers each other on and you become emotional. So a lot of times Treehill will be seen as the non-emotional team, but we're emotional within it. But by the time that people see a surface tension, so we had a company that had a market cap of 7 billion, lost about 60% of the share price. And we went back within 24 hours and said, this is what we think you need to. These are the speech points for your, we've gone through your investor day. We've gone through why shareholders have responded the way they have. We understand why your share price reacted. And we think these are the 10 things that you need to do. We could be on the next flight within 24 hours and walk down each of those pathways. Within a week, we're appointed. And the company said, this is highly effective and efficient. And you guys aren't emotionally attached to it. And the answer is we were actually emotionally attached. But because we've done it so long, you could be nervous on the flight. You could be nervous on the flight there or on the flight back. But when you're in front of the board or shareholders, very much like in the surgical theater, you need to be the cold-blooded person in that room to be able to be effective. Yeah. The minute you get emotional, it's difficult. Now, on a human side of things, some of the restructurings have been very difficult because not all human beings can acknowledge that they failed. So what they do is, as you step in to help, it's like using a drowning analogy. You throw the life, ring to them, and all of a sudden you're the reason why they can't swim. So you do, over the past 10 years, find certain individuals who come for you, and they make it incredibly personal that you are the reason why they got themselves into a position they're in. And those are the ones which are the hardest ones to deal with. And that's driven by human beings, nothing to do with the programs.
You want to name names?
Yeah.
I was just kidding. I don't want you to name names either. I got a lot of friends out there. All right. One last one for you. I'm going to ask you to practice what you preach a little bit. You talk about having foresight, looking beyond nodes and looking down the road, beginning with the end in mind, as we like to say. So what's next? What's the next node and maybe a few nodes down the road for Treehill and for you personally?
Clinical trial disclosure. A topic that I knew nothing about, and the latest aha in my life is clinical trial disclosure. I was invited to talk at a clinical trial disclosure meeting to give my perspectives on it, and it took me a month, and I couldn't develop any single slides on it because I just assumed that people disclose. But what I've learned is only about 11% of ISTs actually publish the data they generate. Negative data is really published, and there is regulatory framework around why you need to publish data, but actually it's not desperately enforced. So companies at the moment is a bit of a wild west. So why is that relevant? It's relevant because all of the information that we're using in advising our clients is based on about 10 to 15% of the data that's out there. Mm-hmm. If all of these studies that have been run genuinely publish their data, as we're advising our clients on what study to do, which indication to choose, which patient subpopulation we should go for, we would be in a far better position if there was a far more robust clinical trial disclosure process than there is at the moment. So when I'm talking about making mistakes, Ali can look at the world through my lens, and I can look at the world and say, look, we've turned around 100 companies. If I then realize that actually I'm only helping 1% of the fraction, our advice could be significantly better if we had more data. Right. And as we're moving into a world where we're talking about AI, etc., well, what does AI pick up? AI picks up the 11% of ISTs, as an example, obviously not all trials are ISTs, that are published. Well, what if we forced or enforced publication? And why am I passionate about it? I'm passionate about it because when patients make an active decision to be recruited to a study, they're either on placebo, they're on experimental treatment, or they're on some sort of therapy. But they're putting their lives on the line for the betterment of science. Don't we owe them the respect that we then publish the data that comes out of it, so the next person who goes into a study isn't being subject to a treatment that we could have known that shouldn't have been run, or a mechanism of action that we know that in that indication shouldn't have worked? I think that industry at the moment, I go as far as saying we're quite blasé about the fact that we're fortunate that human beings, when they're ill, are subjecting themselves to clinical studies, and the least we could do is have a mechanism by which that data is then published.
Yeah, published and then accessible and usable. It's a you open up a whole new conversation for me now, which we don't have time to do today. But for the benefit of our listeners, last week's episode, I had a lengthy conversation with Hillary Eaton. She's the chief business officer at a company called Profluent, and we had a lengthy discussion about the fact that negative data. She is an AI company.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lengthy discussion about the fact that negative data is a giant blind spot in the efficacy and go forward plan of artificial intelligence and machine learning and generative AI in general, particularly in biotech and pharma.
Agreed. And I think, so when you're saying what's next, so first thing that we've done is the latest thing is a CDO model, which is the optimizing clinical study and rolling that out. And that's being embraced by a lot of the CROs and actually a lot of companies. And we're seeing good results from that. I think over the next 12 months is to focus on how do we make clinical trial recruitment far more patient-centric. And so when we talk about patient centricity, then I think data disclosure is a very easily fixable position or a situation. And I feel ashamed that I've been, in the banking industry for 20 years, and I've only just learned this aha moment. But I guess that's what it's all about, that you stumble upon these aha moments and think, wow, that was a blind spot for me. Is it a blind spot for other people? And I think that is the next blind spot that we can address.
Yeah. Well, I've got a lot of questions for you about how to address that we simply don't have time to answer right now. So I'm gonna as I often do when I'm like really in the throes of the conversation and intrigued, but I'm out of time. I'm gonna ask you to come back on sometime. So I'll get with your people. I'll get with your people. We'll extrapolate that because for one, that sounds like that undertaking sounds like that's not like a Treehill to client undertaking. This is an industry wide challenge. I can see your wheels turning and you want to respond. We don't have time. We'll talk about it again next time. But in the meantime, this has been super enlightening. A lot of insight in every response that you gave me, and fun. I've enjoyed the conversation. I've learned a lot, and I thank you sincerely for coming on the show.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me, and I promise if you have me on, I'll try and smile more often.